So welcome to our 15-minute quick, amazing modernism lecture. And this will rub elbows a little bit with our existentialism lecture, but that's going to be a little bit separate because it's focused on Albert Camus. So you're looking at a beautiful Impressionist painting, and you'll figure out why I chose that particular thing. So we're looking at literary modernism, and you may have learned about this last year with Miss Pucci. As you were studying The Wasteland and In the Great Gatsby and all of the sort of disillusionment of that time. And so I'm going to delve a little bit deeper as we look at parts of modernism and more specifically existentialism. So I want to start, every artistic literary movement usually couples with some artistic movements and other movements of thought at the same time, because nothing exists in isolation. So I'm going to take a quick preview through the artistic influence. Like I said, Impressionism, you can see that they're made up of lots of little brushstrokes, and there's different predominant brushstrokes that different people use, but in this case it's just a sense of little brushstrokes creating more of an impression than an actual product of something. So coming off of realism, it was really important that they had extended beyond what trying to portray reality as it was, and looking as sort of what it could be or how they perceived it. So these paintings demonstrated that human beings do not see objects, but instead the light and how the light reflects off of it, more specifically with Impressionism. In addition, Cubism, it was a part of and sprung off of, and many of you know Picasso as a cubist, and there were others. The ladies of Avignon, but Cézanne famously declared that exactitude is not truth, and so they went beyond truth. They tried to sort of explore outside of what already was conceived as truth. They had already extended that, like I said in the last one. So Expressionism, abstract Expressionism in particular, is most associated with Jackson Pollock, but there were a lot of abstract expressionists that tried to focus and express their inner vision, their inner emotion, and inner spiritual reality through their action. So action painting and different, maybe just colors on canvases instead of the actual print itself of an image. So when you go into the Museum of Modern Art in May, you probably will see things like, I could have done that, a kindergarten could have done that, but most likely that's going to be something like abstract expressionism, which focused on what's internal rather than the external realities of objects and events. Here's a famous Jackson Pollock. Avantgarde you've probably heard of quite a bit, and here's like my sweet little beat guy that makes me think of avant-garde. But in particular, in this case, it literally translates to most forwardly placed troops. So think of the people in the front of the line, the people that are, imagining outside of what people already understand to be. The movement sought to eliminate or blur the distinction between art and life, and often introduce elements of mass culture. So as time went on, the pop culture movement was inspired by that. People like Andy Warhol, etc., came after modernism. So these artists aimed to make it new and often represented themselves as alienated from the established order. But I think most artists do in modern and postmodern times. But avant-garde literature and art challenged societal norms and tried to shock the sensibilities of its audience. Dadaism. Mutt is a pseudonym for a really great artist who would just take really typical things that no one would ever think is art, and he put them together to sort of make a commentary on what art was, or which is nonsense. It's a nonsense word in the movement. They emphasized the absurdity and reflected a spirit of nihilism and celebrated the function of chance. And so he just was very playful, and a lot of these guys and women were very playful with objects that seemed to have no meaning and placing a sort of absurd meaning to them. The last thing is montage. There's not really a good definition of it, but they started to place more items and objects side by side to create a more cinematic approach, because cinema was coming about at that time. So This is one of the first cinematic scenes, and if you guys have seen Hugo or read the book Hugo Capret, then you recognize this image, Georges Méliès. But cinema itself is an art form which responded to radical and economical and technological changes. So in the midst of railroad and industrialization and city life, it was in the advent of all this technology, and it heavily influenced artists and also authors. So it was responsible for like a visual stream of consciousness in modernist literature. Next, we're going to look quickly at the historical influences. I'm going to start with Romanticism, which is throwing back a little bit more, and we know that Romanticism is not all about love. You guys learned about Hawthorne, anti-romantic, and Poe, also under the sort of anti-romantic period. But Romanticism came as an artist-centered view and retreated into irrationalism and hallucinations as the modernists took that part on. And so they were really interested in the artist's process and the artist as the center. They tried to find the absolute by transcending what actually was, and also were concerned with the beauty and the commonplace, the natural, the simple, and they searched for the ideal. And we are actually going to focus more on romantics a little bit later on in the school year, but we'll start with just this very basic overview. So they were influenced by them. The modernists were also influenced by the realist movement. From realism, it borrowed its urban setting and a willingness to break taboos. They gleaned the concrete and the immediate from the realists. So if you have ever read William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow, that's just an image poem, a concrete poem. It's pretty fantastic if you ever get a chance to read any of his stuff. Pre-modernism, before modernism, the world was thought of in this realist fashion, where it was an image of reading objects and as they were in an objective fashion. Modernists, however, took the reader into the world of unfamiliarity, a deep introspection, a cognitive, thought-provoking experience, skepticism of religion, openness to culture, technology, and innovation, which did overlap with the realists, but they took their own spin. Darwin was another sort of historical influence. Darwin had challenged the traditional Christian views as God as creator, instead focused on a more natural selective universe, which you guys have learned about in science since a long time ago. The idea of time travel, questioning one's existence, the purpose of the universe, and a suspicion of God were all important parts of that. The Russian Revolution was also happening at the time, which was really influential. It was a shift from country to city, from individuality to production and mass production. If you get a chance to read Benjamin's essay about reproducibility, I can share that with you, but it's really fantastic. You should do that. Anyway, revolutionary shift in development, creation, and the belief in life. Karl Marx shifted from capitalism to a different point of view. And because of the social and economical shifts which took place during this time, electronics, machinery, mass commodity, etc., capitalism and the rise of the bourgeoisie, I guess, eradicated feudalism and brought momentous forms of communication, transportation, and production. Theory of relativity also kind of rocked people's world at the time and influenced the modernists, as Einstein showed that time and motion are not absolute but relative to the observer. Time is viewed as cyclical. Reader is moved from one image to another in flutters rather than its start to finish manner. So you'll notice that there'll be some jumping around, maybe different narrators of different chapters. It's not a linear kind of idea. And also, a juxtaposition of events may unfold at once. So they may, as I said, go between points of view, or shift in flashbacks, and different angles. So it plays with time. The authors have played with time as a result of Einstein. World War I also was a huge influence. First, it was the first intentional war. There was the first sense of people seeing the senseless destruction and alienation of the individual because of war. You can think of experiences in the trenches and the sort of senseless nature. If you guys read Remark, you might be able to glean a little bit more about that. Freud was another major influence, and his little prodigy, I guess, Carl Jung. They looked at modernism. Modernism brought about a new openness to the areas of feminism, bisexuality, the family, and the mind. And again, it was looking not just at It was not just looking at the sexuality piece and the openness, but looking at basic drives and instincts through which the outside world was perceived. Freud and Jung looked at consciousness as multiple. Past is in the present, always coloring our present reality. We are our memories, and that's why it conjures sort of the idea of the couches. The guy on the couch thinking about his past. Another significant historical influence is the Victorian influence, and the reason why this is such an influence is this is what they railed against. This is what the modernists were so annoyed with. They commented on the decadence and the sort of imperfection of this perfect Victorian perception of what was. So if you could pause right now and take a look at what the Victorian influence has to say here. I am not going to go through it for you. Okay, most likely you have just now come back to me. And we're going to go to the attributes of modernism. Basically, it's just a representing of reality. So it's not like the realists tried to do, which was represent it exactly, but rather represent it through an individual point of view. So this is where the idea of Impressionism comes in, trying to portray psychological impressions of objects and events that they make on characters. It emphasizes the role of the individual perception and explores the nature of the conscious and unconscious mind. So we're going to read a little piece by Virginia Woolf where she just has this sort of like psychological stream of consciousness about something called the mark on the wall. So that will give you kind of a better idea of that. Perspectivism is another thing. We talked about Nietzsche in our summer reading. He viewed the interpretation as the essential condition of human life or human existence. So it's really about individual interpretation, human beings finding meaning in their own existence through constant acts of interpreting, and then that interpreting is only carried out from that person's perspective, and perspectives could shift. So he didn't believe in absolutes. He didn't believe in truths in that way. They also really looked into the interior of the mind, the symbolic psychological landscape. So Joyce called it an epiphany. Alan Hopkins called it inscape, and then Woolf called it a moment of being, but taking time, kind of like a Montaigne-esque essay where we attempt to understand the world. That's sort of a part of the modernists there. Stream of consciousness, which I know you have learned a little bit about, is another part of that. So pause and read a little bit about stream of consciousness. Intertextuality. This should look familiar from our summer reading. The literary experiment is a response to epic tradition of some other conversation and parts of conversation. This is also known as like the dialogic. You're dialoguing across time and space. The literature itself, there's some major themes. The first one is anti-establishment, rebellious spirit. Whoa, hey-oh. The critique of the traditional values and culture, opposition of hostility of convention, social, religious, political, and economic values and principles, which you saw in the previous slide about the Victorian era. Absurdism, we're going to delve much more deeply into that. It's a search for a ground of meaning in the world without God. They question the reality of experience itself, and it's not about that God doesn't exist, it's just that humans can't explain God, and so I'll get into that further with the next lecture. But the absurdists tried to duplicate in literature the absurd conditions of contemporary life. You know, these nameless millions of dying in war, commonplace horrors like the Holocaust, a world in which God is dead, casts mankind afloat in chartless and unknowable world void of a spiritual center. So just a lot of stuff was happening in the world, and people were having a hard time making sense of it. So with it came this sort of sense of alienation and angst and non-understanding. So you can read a little bit more about that or hear more about that in the next lecture. Oops. Search for self, is the next one. Loss of meaning and hope in the modern world of exploration. That people tried to find sense in the world and they couldn't, so they looked inside. And that was really important to them. And then the individual's relationship to history. The stylistic and substantial references to Greco-Roman mythology. If you read Joyce, I know Miss Pucci is a big fan of Joyce, you can see a lot of connections to and allusions to Greek and Roman mythology to help explain our relationship in the center. So pause for characterization.